Buddy, thanks for joining. So I'm going to get started here. Would be great if you have questions. I want to try and keep this as conversational as possible. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. I'm watching the chat. We've got team members that are also watching the chat. And my goal here is really just to give you a bit of a developer overview, give you a sense of what the platform looks like, how to work with us. And then I've got some examples of how to work with our API and a little bit of just some ideas on what to think about as you're thinking about your application design and how to map it to our API and things like that. But I'm more than happy to answer questions along the way. Feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I have some slides, but don't worry, it's not going to be all slides. There's going to be some real content here as well. I thought I would start a little bit with a bit of a background and how I look at the space. I actually started in tech. I started in an internet provider in the early 90s. It was one of the first internet providers in Canada. I cut my teeth on early Linux and early versions of DNS and bind and networking and things like that. I guess the good news is that a lot of the Linux stuff and the Unix stuff that I was doing in those days is still relevant today. But there was a lot of, kind of heavy learning in those days, also just crazy scale. Like the internet business in those days literally went from like nobody's heard of it to everybody wants one. So that was a lot of fun. I was my first CTO role was in 2000. It was a company in Hawaii, and we built software for all kinds of industries, insurance, financial services, government, and we did a lot of kind of interesting things. But that was mostly like large, kind of unusual integration work. And then I moved back to Canada, and I was not quite sure what to do. There was a lot of things that I wasn't allowed to do based on my earnout agreement. And so a friend of mine convinced me to join a bank. And he said, it's going to be really fun. It's going to be really relaxing. You're going to love banking. And it was interesting, but I can't say it was relaxing because about 6 or 8 months after I joined, we decided we were going to blow the bank up and replace about 95% of the technology. We launched a transformation project. We had a budget of about $360 million, and we replaced the core banking system. We replaced all the channels. We replaced basically anything that wasn't locked down got replaced, and some things that were. But for me, I learned a lot about banking in that process. And I think what I learned the most in that time was not so much the what of banking, but a lot of the why. Because if you're going to blow something up and replace it, you need to understand what it did, but you also need to understand why it was there. So that was a really, really interesting project, and my sort of first taste of banking. Went on to become the global head of solution architecture at the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. That was a different kind of organization. So they're a fairly large bank. At the time, I'm not sure these days, they had about 100,000 employees, and we're very global. So for me, a lot of that was about global banking, commercial banking, cap markets, trading, stuff like that. If you've ever read the book Flash Boys, that was kind of RBC sort of during this time, very interesting. I ended up joining a small German company called SAP for a while. I was focused on financial services, and sort of had some ideas about blockchain and integrating SAP into some blockchain scenarios with banks, and ended up becoming one of the 3 people driving blockchain strategy at that organization. And then the last thing that I was doing just before I joined Synctera and got involved in starting Synctera up was I was the CTO at a venture capital fund called Portage Ventures. And in that role, I did a lot of tech due diligence. I was also a CTO at one of their major investments, which is a company called Coho Financial. And Coho is a neobank. And so I joined as the CTO and the fourth person in the engineering team at Coho. And it was, I would say, a really exciting experience. A lot of stuff to build. You know, we had to build the team, we had to build the platform, we had to fight fraud, we had to come up with new product features. So that was, that's kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm, drawing on my experience to talk a little bit about getting started from a FinTech perspective, working with our APIs. And a lot of the things that we have at Synctera are really here because of some of the gaps that I saw while working at Coho, just gaps in the industry. Like it seemed like whatever we wanted to do in financial services, it was harder than it should be. Nobody had an API for that. There's a lot of like kludgy file types that we had to work with. There wasn't a great sort of ledgering solution out there. And it seemed like whatever we wanted to do, no matter what, we had to build it. Like there was nothing was easy. So a lot of, what I thought about in thinking about what's needed at Synctera, I thought about it through the lens of a FinTech, and specifically, when you think about the relationship between the FinTech and the bank, there's a lot of potential friction in the relationship because banks don't necessarily have visibility into what's going on. And so part of the platform that we solve for is really thinking about, what does the FinTech need? And the answer is really capabilities through an API in a way that makes sense. What does the bank need? Transparency, visibility, and to make sure that they can sleep at night, that they're going to keep their license. And so what we've tried to do is solve for that with our platform. The Synctera platform really, I'll take you through a little bit of like how we build and what we've built, just to give you a sense before we get into the API and how to work with us, just to give you a sense of kind of how we think about developing software. But the Synctera app and platform, basically the banks log in. So the banks are logging in, they can see, they can see a dashboard, they can see kind of a regulatory panel and a view of areas that are in motion from a case review perspective. But really our platform provides a source of truth for customer, for account, and transaction. And to me, these are the three core pillars of banking information. If I've got that data organized, mastered, understood, clear, without any garbage in it, on those three pillars, I'm feeling pretty good. And I can connect third parties into that data. I can connect payment networks into that data. And with a solid ledger and those three pillars, in general, to me, this is the foundation of financial services. So we provide that as a kind of light core. FinTechs can connect to that through our API. Banks can see what's going on through the app, and we help to keep everything kind of going in the middle. Now, I'm going to focus on these two boxes, but just to give you a sense of like where you are and what we've built. This is our overall architecture. Everything from this third-party layer up, these are services and capabilities that we've built and defined. So like this pink zone here, and I'm not quite sure why it's pink. I was just feeling, I think, pink that day. But this pink zone here, these are all services that my engineering team is working on they're, adding capabilities to those services and making that happen. The developer portal, the API, and the sandbox are connecting to those services through the API gateway. The API gateway enforces our identity concepts, our authorization concepts, our role-based access control, and kind of manages the routing of all that. But basically, my team is spending most of their time kind of in this layer here in the middle. A little bit more about how we build. Where everything that we do is in GitLab. So our repos are in GitLab, CI/CD is in GitLab. We write up our issues in GitLab, and some of that is because I think in my last organization, it seemed like we had we had Jira tickets over here, we had GitHub repo over there, we had 2 people babysitting Jenkins, we had 1 person babysitting Circle. And it just seemed like things were sort of all over the place. And so at Synctera, I thought, centralization would be useful, and less is more when it comes to, stuff like that. It's like sprawling out my CI/CD, sprawling out my repo, disconnecting the repo from the issues and tickets, not that useful. So, and I think overall, I think that's going pretty well. We write most of our API code in Go. And this is the second company where I've used Go. I think there's a couple things I like about Go. It's a fairly modern language for backend. It's very, I would say it's very network aware. It's very HTTP aware. It's quite efficient. It's quite opinionated. So there are not a lot of ways to do Go. There are some variances in terms of how different people look at structuring, and there's various sort of middlewares that some people believe in and others don't. But in general, the community is pretty much aligned on what good Go looks like. We also developed some services in Python. The delineation there is most of our external APIs are written in Go. And then data and internal services we write in Python. The front end that we have is written in React. And we deploy on GCP. So GCP is our cloud. I think I've done a lot of work with AWS, and in my last company, I had about half of my workload, maybe 3/4 of my workload on AWS, and then we had all the data and some ancillary services on GCP. And I just thought that with Google, I liked their Kubernetes story, and I liked their serverless story, and I really liked their data story and capabilities, and so that's why we landed there. And then we use Terraform for all of our infrastructure deployment and all of that. So enough about us. Let's talk a little bit more. Well, I guess I need to talk a little bit about security before we go any further, just because security is really important in everything we do. And in financial services, security is paramount. It's always a factor. We've had to be, I think, quite a bit more mature from a security perspective than I think most startups would want to be at this stage. And the reason is that as a B2B platform, as a banking as a service platform in financial services, we're under a lot of scrutiny from the banks. We have a lot of auditors that want to look around. And so we really started with this in mind, started thinking about a SOC 2 pretty much day one. And that's all, I think, going reasonably well. We have a zero trust services landscape, which I mentioned. And basically, like one of the first things that we built here at Synctera was a PII vault that stores any highly classified data. So anything like a social security number or a card number, we just put that right in the vault and then tokenize it and then use the token in our databases. So anything that's in a level 2 data classification level 2 doesn't even get stored in our databases. One of the things that I'm hoping you've seen by now is our dev portal. And if you haven't seen the dev portal, check it out. It's dev.synctera.com. Also, if you don't have an API key, let us know in the chat, and we'll get you one right away, because that becomes, I think for me, I'm really a tacit learner. Like if somebody tells me that they've got a great API, that sounds fine, but I kind of need to see it. And one of the most important things, which I'm going to talk about in this workshop, is thinking about some of your models and concepts, and then thinking about the APIs that you're working with, including ours, and doing the mapping to make sure that that these things are coming together in a way that makes sense. So please check out our dev portal. Let's get started. So some of the things to think about in your front end. What is your front end stack? So I've got like a fake FinTech that I started to build here, just as an example. And so I'll take you through some of my choices, but I'd love to hear about your choices as well. Okay, and somebody asked for an API key, and we're going to take note of that, and I'll get you a key after this session. So when I thought about this, I thought, it'd be fun for this workshop for me to actually like start building a FinTech and get a sense of what it's like to use our API, and get a sense of like, what are some of the decisions that I would want to make when building a FinTech. So what's my front end stack? So I picked Flutter. I've been like tinkering around with Flutter for a couple of years, and Flutter came up with some advances recently that I thought would be fun to check out. So I built a little app in Flutter. This is my Flutter app. Put together some screens. So my front end stack is basically Flutter, and my approach would be, if I was launching a FinTech right now with this app, I would probably ship an app on the App Store and probably have a web app. And I'm sort of working on this sort of use case of building these reusable screens that could be deployed, either packaged into a web app or shipped and available as a deployment in the App Store. So what else do you want to think about? Well, you're going to need some sort of backend API, and like I think there's a lot of things that you want to do probably to service your app and service your front end that only you really want to do, right? So it's not like, we've got capabilities in our back end, we can register customers, and that's fine, but you probably want to track things in the front end, and you want to service your app and secure your app with a back end API of your own. So I built a little back end here. Just something, I put something together really simple in Flask. And so I've got some routes here. You can see, really, I've just got customer routes. So I didn't do anything with accounts and transactions yet. But, just built some simple customer routes, getting posts on customer. And then what these routes are doing is mapping back to the Synctera API. If you take a look at the customer, file here. Basically, getting the customer is hitting our API, hitting the customer's endpoint, getting the response, prettifying that, and returning it. You take a look at the environment. If you take a look at the environment file here, you get a sense here of the URL. So basically, I just set an environment variable with the base URL, which is API sandbox.synctera.com. And then my API key becomes the bearer token. And so again, we want to think a little bit about your backend stack. In my case, I'm using Flask. I just thought it would be cheap and cheerful to whip something up here. And then I guess the other question I would think about here is, like, do you want to use client libraries in your backend? Do you want to use raw requests? I kind of go back and forth on this one, and it depends on the API. Sometimes I like to use client libraries if the API is pretty mature, and but I typically want to use requests when I want to make sure that I'm getting like the latest, greatest view of the API capabilities. Sometimes there can be a gap between the client libraries and the APIs. In our case, we've got client libraries here published for Go, and we update those periodically, like I would say like every few months. We generate client libraries as a part of our build process. And, I think we're quite curious to understand what's, whether you prefer client libraries as an example, or whether you just want to work with requests and work directly with the API. Should we be, putting more effort into our client libraries, or should we just be like focusing on the API, and you guys can generate your own, or you guys can work directly with the request stack? So let us know what you think. Someone is, we've got some information shared here on someone's stack. That's really interesting. Front-end React Native, Apollo client. Makes a lot of sense. Backend Apollo server, TypeScript, Prisma. It's nice that you've got, you've got TypeScript, I guess, on both sides, right? So you can kind of, your team can be pretty fungible probably between front end and back end. Postgres, which is, I think Postgres is now the standard in the world of FinTech. In my last job, one of the things I used to do is FinTech due diligence, and I do about 150 due diligence workshops a year with FinTechs that are looking for funding. So it's a great way just to understand, like, what are people using, what's out there. And I would say it's like Postgres is probably 95% of the time what I'm seeing out in the field. My first Postgres project was in, I want to say 2001. And it was because the project I was working on, we were launching a company, and I'm not sure if you followed what happened in 2001, but basically the floor came out on venture capital, and so our company was not going to get funded. Funding was no longer a thing, and so we had to bootstrap everything. We changed everything from basically name brand software to open source, but probably was a great decision anyway. It was a little bit early in those days for some of the projects we adopted, but in retrospect, it worked great. And those projects, most of them became the core of things that we would run today, including Postgres. At the time was also like Tomcat and stuff like that. But, so these are our client libraries. Let us know in the chat if you prefer client libraries, or if you prefer to work against requests. In my case, I just did requests because I thought, if I'm just ingesting client libraries, isn't really going to show a lot. So you can see what I did here is I just wrapped requests and just said, okay, go and post this. The URL I get from the environment. The JSON, well, JSON did in this case, I just have a customer JSON example, which is here. This I just basically pulled off our website. I wasn't creative enough to create my own. I just went to the dev site under customer, and did the drop down here under customer. That's the account area. So let's just take a look at customer. One of the things that I realized in looking at our dev site through the eyes of a developer is that there's a lot of stuff here. So, one of the things that I had to do to be ready to kind of work with the dev site was just focus on what I need right now, right? So in the case of customer, creating a customer, I need this payload. But some of the stuff I didn't need, so I cut it out. Like I didn't need related customers. That wasn't useful for me. And we included it here for completeness, but for my demo, you can see that I just like cut that out. The shipping, I looked at what's required. So first name is required, date of birth is required, last name is required, status is required. Well, what are the different status types? Active, frozen, escheat, deceased, sanctioned, dormant, denied. Active sounds good. I'm gonna change this to active. Doesn't really matter. I can create the customer in pretty much any format, any status. Let's set this to active. But yeah, so this customer, this customer, these functions are just basically, wrapping requests, and just to make it a little bit easier. So so there's a comment here. I usually I use client libraries, especially they require some special auth. Okay. Yeah, so I'll keep that in mind. So your backend is TypeScript. So maybe we prioritize, creating some client libraries there. So yeah, what else should I think about here? So I shared a little bit about the backend stack, requests or libraries. I need to think a little bit about the cloud provider. What cloud am I on? Again, I've seen successful fintechs on all clouds. One of the things that I've seen is like projects that start with like Heroku. It can be a great way to get started, but there's a point where you start to hit a bit of an inflection point on the cost. Like some teams start with Heroku for like just ease of use, lack of any sort of DevOps type team or requirement, and it's pretty developer friendly. When you get to a certain volume, it starts to the costs start to sort of creep up. That's actually something to watch in general with anything that makes your life easier. Definitely look at it, use it, but also like understand what happens with it once you get to scale. Because as an example, when I was at Coho, I'm probably not going to mention the vendor's name, but we got to one point where like we had this platform, this plugin that was really fun. It was great, worked great. We used it every day, and then I think we got to like 150,000 users or 150,000 customers or something, and the MAUs were it just became nuts. Like when you start to get the phone calls from like the enterprise representatives and they're like treating you nicely and sending you gift baskets and stuff, it's going to be a problem. So yeah, and there's some chats there saying people agree with that. So just like sometimes it's fine, like yeah, this is going to make our life easier for 6 months, but also know when it's time to scale out of it, so it's not a surprise. Also think about your web application firewall. So one of the themes that I've noticed in financial services and fintech in general is that you should expect to be under attack, because that's just how it works. So like just like be prepared for cyber attack, be prepared for fraudsters. And it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you have looked at like the crypto community, but I was involved in a crypto initiative, and you put something out there and you just sort of know people are going to try and attack it. Like that's normal. That's what happens. And so you sort of build defense in depth, expecting that, and then just lean into it once you launch. And my colleague Olivier mentions that the Synctera UI is written in TypeScript and talks for APIs via TypeScript SDK. I think it's a great idea. If people are interested in that, if there's interest in the TypeScript SDK, certainly happy to release that if it makes people's lives easier. So what else do we got here? So some of the first steps. So definitely get an API key. from the dev portal, import the open API spec. What I did, so like when I first started looking at this, before I did the wrapping in Python of requests, is I just imported the spec into Postman. I just started playing with the API. So what happens when I create a customer? Do I get a 201? Does it 400? Why is it 400ing? And then get the schemas right on the JSON side to understand like what do I need to, what does a customer look like for me? And then what do I need to create there? Download or generate the client libraries. Oops. And then map the API to your application flow. So this is, this was an interesting exercise. So as I started to look at this in the front end, so within my Flutter app, I started to think a little bit about, okay, well, what does customer mean for me? And, how am I signing up a customer? What kinds of things do I want to ask a customer? When you look at the portal, there's a lot of stuff here, right? When you take a look at this, like, customer schema, there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to ask the customer all those things, am I? Probably not. But when you look at what's really required, we need a date of birth, we need a first name, last name, status, and a legal address. Basically, everything else is optional. So I took that into account when I defined my model here in Dart, and I just created a simple customer class, and I sort of I mirrored the customer class on what's in the API. But practically speaking, I probably would look at ways to sort of make this more seamless. Like when we're building a customer-facing app, we're always thinking about friction, and the more things you ask a consumer, the higher the chance that they're going to drop off, right? So we're always trying to manage this like regulatory to like friction, customer friction sort of dynamic. Things I've done in the past to make this easier, as an example, is do address lookups and say, hey, pick your address, confirm that this is your address, and then just drop that in the payload behind the scenes. So you don't need to necessarily have them enter all the things. And the other thing I would say is SSN for us is optional. This is going to vary largely based on your use case, based on the financial instruments that you're working with, based on your realities. In my case, I always tried to avoid asking for SSN. It's a big ask. And I would, if somebody came to me with a great idea of asking for SSN, I would always kind of push back on it, try and understand it. Is there a regulatory need here? And get a sense of it. The other thing I've done in this space in the past is like using some of the identity services that are out there. I can get a customer identity and I can compare it with what the customer is telling me, and I can do some basic validation at that level. But this is my customer model basically in this app. And I've got some helpers here to be able to create the list of customers and so forth. And that maps more or less back to this customer schema. So then thinking about, I guess the other thing to think about is what's your onboarding flow? And like I was mentioning, there's always this tension with onboarding. We want to make it as simple as possible. When I first started at Coho, one of the first tickets I jumped on was related to KYC. And it was something like pretty simple. It was like, well, KYC is over here and we want to move it here. I was like, fine, that's a good first ticket. So I jumped on that and I thought, well, this will be interesting. I'll do a little bit of KYC and then I'll forget about it. I'll forget about onboarding and I'll work on other things. Well, the reality was like pretty much every quarter there was an onboarding ticket. Like we were always tweaking onboarding. We're always tuning onboarding. I would say, things you want to think about with onboarding. First of all, how are you collecting data for onboarding? Because your onboarding data is gold. So understanding drop off, understanding customer journey, understanding successful journey, knowing when you change something in the onboarding flow, what the impact is there, is gold. So have some instrumentation for your onboarding flow. Make sure it's flexible because you're going to be moving things around probably with your onboarding flow. You're going to be tweaking and tuning that. Think about sensors, and I'll go a bit deeper on this in a minute. But think about sensors and how you're assessing risk during onboarding. Think about step ups. So one of the things I used to say when I was in the fintech business is we want to create like a really seamless experience for customers and offer a really crappy experience for fraudsters. And so like be able to sort of assess risk and be able to step up your process and maybe change the process depending on the type of risk that you're sensing. But for real customers, we want like really low friction. Ideally you just drop your email and go. It's never that easy, but I mean, you want as least the least number of clicks as possible. Fighting fraud, like I mentioned, we want to expect to be under attack. We want to expect that people are going to be trying to do things to game the platform. It could be something as simple as referral gaming. It could be something as sophisticated as people with stolen identities trying to extract funds from other accounts, pull them into your platform and cash it out. When it comes to sensing risk, there's a lot of interesting data here. There's a lot that you can do around understanding device. So if that's if it's an existing customer with a new device, that's interesting. Could have been the result of some sort of a brute force attack on their password somewhere else, and now they're coming in with a new device. But it's interesting to know that they've got a new device. I used to think about device journey. So if somebody goes, let's say, from an iPhone 10 to an iPhone 11, not that unusual, right? People get upgrades, that happens. If someone goes from an iPhone 12 to an iPhone 9, like what's that about? And like just stepping that up and saying, yeah, you can use the app with that new device, but you do have restricted capabilities. You can't extract money, you can't move money until you validate that device, confirm the device, and off we go. So a little bit of, adds a little bit of friction, but helps to avoid a pretty bad day for some customer in an account takeover scenario. Identity is really important. So like understanding how someone passed KYC. I used to think of KYC. KYC sounds annoying and something like something that you just need to do for government regulations, but KYC is one of the best ways to assess whether you're dealing with a fraudster or whether you're dealing with a real customer. How they pass KYC, how many attempts they have at KYC is interesting. Whether it's entirely a bureau pass or like, do they have a selfie check? That's interesting. So as an example, like, fraudsters in general, unless there's a defect with the selfie check software, typically won't pass a selfie check or go through that effort. They like, if they're dealing with stolen identity, they like just kind of bouncing those identities off a bureau check and wanting to go forward with that. Card use, are they virtual card only? Have they ever used a physical card? That's a good indicator that you have a real person on the other end. What's the source of this? They came to us from somewhere. What's the source? Was it a campaign? Was it a referral? What's their relationship mapping to other customers? And so one of the things that I found really interesting about fraudsters is that fraudsters cannot resist like even a small referral incentive. So, if you get $5 for a referral bonus, the fraudsters will do that all day long. And so when you find one, you take a look at who, where they got all their referral bonuses from, and you'll find, 10, and you can sort of rip them all out at the same time by looking at the mappings. If you find a real fraudster, a confirmed fraudster, and you look at the relationships and who they referred and who they send money to, that's great data. So think about relationship mappings in your system as well. And then just basic bot detection. So, tools like, web application firewall, people like Cloudflare have bot detection, and they can help manage that. API concept mapping. So I talked about this a little bit. I didn't get as far as mapping, the accounts and transactions, but you want to think about what is your customer model? Take a look at our API, take a look at our model, understand, what the mandatory elements are and what's optional. Understand at what point you would want to send that data back to our API. Basically, what's important for us from a customer API perspective is that we help the bank have visibility into the customer's regulatory journey. And one of the reasons that we do that is to make it easier for you on the FinTech side to manage things, move things around, and be able to manage that process. We want you to be able to have a flexible onboarding experience. What used to happen with me in my previous organization is we'd have a great idea for onboarding. We'd add some data elements, or we'd remove some, or we'd make it more seamless, or we'd change the order of screens a bit. And then we'd have to go and talk to the bank and have a new conversation about how we're doing KYC and how we're doing onboarding. What we've done at Synctera is we have a decoupled style approach where we capture that information. We understand that the flow is going in a certain way. We understand the customer's regulatory journey, and then we share that with the bank, or we tell the bank basically that this customer is KYC'd and they look good and everything looks normal. So what we need from you is basically to get that data to be able to present that to the bank so that they feel good and can sleep at night. So I mean, after you've done your onboarding, and let me just show you sort of how I thought about this in my app. This is my super cool FinTech app. I'm not sure that I can make this any bigger. Oh, maybe I can. Okay. This is my super cool FinTech app. It's super, maybe it's not the best name, but I like it. It's super cool FinTech app. We're going to need some sort of login. So you're going to want to think a little bit about, how you log people in. What is your security practice there? You'll if you're going in the direction of cards, you'll probably want to think a little bit about, things like password quality control and, things like that. So you want to think a little bit about, your login, your authentication mechanism. You want to think about your sign up flow. What information are you capturing? So do I capture first name and last name separately? Do I capture it as one and then break it out and maybe confirm? Some people have 3 names. Some people have 4 names. It's, there's always, I kind of mentioned it on this screen, there's always a happy path, and there's always kind of a litany of edge cases. But think a little bit about that flow. Think a little bit about, how you want to do KYC and what your KYC flow is like. So, if I do a KYC flow, once I've got the customer, like in our model, if you look at the KYC docs, once I've got the customer, I basically KYC off of the customer reference. So I've got a customer's created, that's great. Now, I basically go back and run a verification based on the customer's ID. So we get a result here. So the other thing that we can do, so because our platform is multi-capability, we offer you the ability to KYC with us. So we'll just KYC. You create a customer. If we're what we call a leading ledger, so we're the book of record for a customer. We'll KYC the customer when you onboard. We'll let you know when you create them, whether they're good and everything works or not. The other option that we have is, let's say you're already in flight, you've already got, a program running, a couple 100,000 customers, and you've already got a KYC provider. We can be the shadow ledger for that customer, and you can add the KYC information to that. But once you've tackled like your onboarding flow, once you've tackled like how you're going to do KYC, the next thing to think about in KYC world is, like I mentioned, like happy path is great, but maybe if we see too much risk, if something's not looking great from a KYC perspective, we may need to step it up. We may need to do, like, let's say an ID selfie check. So take a picture of your ID front and back, do a selfie check for liveness, and then we'll pass you. You may have a manual flow. It's important to figure all of that out as a part of your onboarding experience. Like again, when I was in the FinTech business, we would look at KYC pass rate as a part of our growth metric, right? So how many people we're passing is a key part of our growth. If you're turning away 25% of the people that are showing up, that are making it to that point in your onboarding funnel, that's pretty painful, pretty expensive, because your customer acquisition cost to get them to that point, it's taken a lot to get them to that point. Would be great to figure out a way to get them through. I've tried a lot of things in this space. I've built like chat bots that like talk people through passing KYC. We've had support centers. We've done selfie check. We've done manual ID verification. At Synctera, we've got, like, with our KYC partner, Socure, behind the scenes, we've got kind of a one-stop shop approach with this, where we've got risk sensor checks in there. We've got KYC checks in there. We've got we've got selfie check capability. We've got manual in there. But it's really up to you to define that journey and figure out the journey that makes sense for your community, for your customers, and get that right. So it's a good question here. What other metrics have you used in the past that help drive user growth? Well, I mean, basically CAC is king, right? So customer acquisition cost is really important. Understanding your CAC, being able to hack the CAC is really important, because if you can figure out a way to build your community and make that community go pretty much viral, and generate new leads without having to spend money with the big fangs, you're in business. Like that's a big that's like a big driver. Do we track K factor? We did not track K factor, but we would look at. We spent a lot of time, energy on tracking attribution, and especially tracking attribution all the way from campaign back to download. And there was a lot of work we had to do in like growth hacking to figure out some days, like I'd wake up every day and I'd look at my growth metrics from the previous day. And like, if we had like 1,500 users, that was great, but where did they come from and why? And, if we had like 2,000 or 3,000 users, that could be great, but also could be we could be under attack, right? So I was always kind of living a little bit on edge with growth. Like, I was happy, but I wanted to know where it came from. So tracking attribution, being able to understand the customer's journey to source is really interesting. And so for example, we had at one point We had a really good campaign running as a referral with another company. I think they gave us like there was some ridiculous number, like 15,000 users in a couple of days, and we're just like, wow, these customers are amazing. We love these customers. And there was like they got some kind of bonus to join. What we realized though is that they were just in for the bonus. Like they just grabbed the bonus and you know, off they went. And you know, the good news is we had the ability to track all that to understand, you know, what a good customer looks like, what the right behavior is, and what maybe doesn't work. Anyway, after you've figured out all of the onboarding, growth, KYC, fraud topics, you've mapped your customer to our customer endpoints, you've understood kind of how our KYC works, how you're going to work with us from a KYC perspective. The next thing to really figure out is like, what are your core products? What are the features of those products? How are they going to behave? And I would suggest really thinking about this on 3 layers. Like, what's the customer experience? And I would always start with that. I'd always understand that first. That's the North Star. Customer wakes up in the morning. What do they do? Why do they love you? But then, like, also think about the customer's happy path. You know, what does the sort of mean of the curve look like here? And then in financial services, we always want to like throw the design off some edge cases. Well, what happens if the customer is doing this? Or what happens if what happens if they, you know, come in like that? So think about that from a customer experience perspective. Think about the fund flow. So behind the scenes, one of the things that we work on is we manage all the reconciliation of the funds. We can manage the fund flow. We can manage the fund flow between you and the bank. We can manage the fund flow between you and the processor. We have a processor that we offer, and so you can issue cards with us. You can, you know, if you process with us, we handle the authorization flow. So the fund flow design is kind of less of a concern in that case. But if you're using, let's say, a third party to do some money movement over here, there's going to be some fund flow work. And so think about that. Think about think about how that fund flow happens. And there's sort of 2 sides of that. There's like, how do we communicate the fund flow? And that this can be like different financial services partners, and you let them know that, hey, we're moving this here, we're moving that there. But then the actual flow of funds from their account to your account, and keeping an eye on that. One of my mantras is, and I probably have said this to my team, you know, maybe 5 times since we started here, but funds in motion are funds at risk. And so you want to track all of the, not just the macro movement of funds, but all the micro movement of funds. These funds are going to this third party, but now they're going into, you know, into a suspense account because the wire hasn't gone yet. You know, so track all of the micro movements. They'll thank me later, because one day if somebody taps you on the shoulder and say, hey, you know, we can't find this money, it looks like we got a leak in the process. Having that type of double entry accounting everywhere in every flow will really help with that. The other thing to think about is a regulatory and risk design. We help connect banks and fintechs. We help connect fintechs to banking partners. We also help with, I would say, some of the creativity around these 3 dimensions. And some of the best conversations I've been involved in are, you know, fintechs that come to us with a great idea, and you know, a lot of passion around that idea, a community. And then we start thinking together about, well, you know, how could we actually move the money? How could we actually design this? How are the regulators going to look at this? Like, you know, we're not calling it a loan, but maybe the regulators are going to call it a loan. What are the boundaries there? You know, I've been really proud of the great regulatory team that we've been able to put together here at Synctera. People that really understand the space, that we can bounce ideas off as well. And one of the challenges I had as a fintech was, it seemed like I could never get a straight answer around where the regulatory lines were. Like, you know, when I would ask a regulator, I'd say, well, you know, do you like, you know, do you allow this? They would say, well, show us the design, and we'll tell you if we don't like it. but that's not very creative. Like I'd love to have, you know, when I was in that role, I would have loved to have had someone that is more of a design partner to be able to kind of bounce ideas off, like how should we design this? What are some of the things to think about? And you know, with our fintechs, we've played that role. I've been involved in some really interesting conversations there. Yeah, so this is the super cool fintech. This is a little bit about our API, a little bit about how we think about things at Synctera. A bit about our dev portal. Again, you know, if you don't have an API key, please please reach out to us, let us know, and we'll get you one. Some fintechs have also asked, what do the banks see? Like, so when the banks log in, they see this, they see this type of dashboard. They get a view of customers that are the partners, and they have a view of cases. And basically in our platform, if something looks unusual, if it looks like there's an anomaly, we create a case. We help bring your attention to it. We help the bank oversee that. There's a question, where do we reach out to get an API key? You can click this button. And if you click on that button, then if you fill this out, then you get an API key. I think the other way to do it is if you drop in the chat, hey, I need an API key, we'll take note of that and we'll make sure we get you one. Or if you had one and you lost it, no problem, we'll create you a new one. Not an issue at all. Also, let us know. We heard the request for TypeScript, SDK, client libraries. Let us know what other client libraries you like, and we'll factor that in. And always happy to take feedback on the API. So any feedback you have, we've got a community Slack. Check out the community Slack. There's an API discussion channel in the community Slack. Jump in there. Happy to continue the conversation. I'm happy to have, you know, chats in there. If you have questions about the API, if you have feedback on the API. We're a startup too. We're shipping code every day, and we're trying to make the platform better every day. So more than happy to help with that. Oh, and we've got a question. Need an API key, please? No problem. We'll get you an API key. Great stuff. Any more questions before we close? Let me make sure I catch it all. Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate the information. I've got a question here on onboarding. Basically, the onboarding architecture, onboarding process is like your customer's journey from the point that they land in your app to when they sign up. And so you're really gonna want to get the design of that right, because oh, sorry, what's the onboarding process? The onboarding process for Synctera, basically, if you don't have an API key with us, then you can just hit the contact us and say, I'm a fintech and I'm not yet a client, or I am a client, and we'll help you out. We'll get you a key. After an API key, basically what we do is we work with you on your solution. We understand your solution. We match you to a bank, and then we take it from there. Yeah, so right now I think there's a point, you know, what's the onboarding process after the API key? It is quite manual right now. The matching is pretty manual. We've got a collection of banks that have signed up on our platform, and we're really like sharing with them your you know, your business and getting them committed to being the sponsor, being the partner. Our goal is to make that, you know, very much automated in the future, and that's, you know, that's something that we're working on in the beginning of 2022. Is it a pitch to each suitable bank? Yeah, basically we have some banks that we know are interested in certain kinds of deals. Like some banks will say, oh, we want crypto, and other banks will say like, we don't want crypto. We'll try and find the right match. Some banks are interested in larger deals. Some banks are interested in earlier stage. So we try and find the right match for the right fintech. At scale, this will be a lot easier, right? So once we have more banks in the platform, more licenses, more capabilities, this will be much more automated. And so the other thing to think about is you want to also, think about like your next product, maybe a different kind of product that might require a completely different type of bank partnership. Like in my last firm, we launched a lending product. The deposit sponsor wasn't interested. So it's a different appetite for different products. But thanks very much for joining. I know we're a minute over. Really appreciate the questions, appreciate the feedback. Let's do this again. And thanks very much.